Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Import Bonds in the Crossfire of Trade Wars. My name is Jennifer Rome and I will be the moderator for this webinar. Today's presentation is scheduled to run for about 50 minutes, but due to the number of attendees and level of interest, we do expect it to run a little longer. All attendees will receive a link to a recording of this webinar and the accompanying slides in an email within a few days. Before we get started, please note that there are 4 handouts accessible in the right-hand panel of the GoToWebinar pane. You may also interact with us today if you wish. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type your questions in the questions box in the control panel at the right of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time allows, and we'll leave the webinar open for about 20 minutes in the event time runs over and we can't address all the questions. So let's talk about your presenters today. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce today's presenters, both Cameron Roberts and Patrice Lafayette. With more than 25 years of experience in international trade, Cameron Roberts is a partner at Roberts and Cahageris LLP in Long Beach, California. Mr. Roberts' practice areas include customs, export compliance, domestic and international transportation law, maritime law, and trade and insurance issues. He is a licensed customs broker and former transportation executive. Cameron is also a member of numerous trade and legal associations and is the chairman of the board of the Foreign Trade Association and serves as an advisor to the board of the Harbor Transportation Club. Additionally, Mr. Roberts is a frequent presenter and author on topics related to his practice areas. Because of his extensive knowledge, Mr. Roberts has qualified as an expert witness in federal court, is admitted to practice in California and Washington, the Court of International Trade, and before the Federal Maritime Commission. Patrice Lafayette joined Roanoke Trade in 2007 and currently is Assistant Vice President of Client Services for Roanoke's Western Division. Ms. Lafayette is in charge of overseeing operations in the bond department, as well as client relations in the western region of the U.S. Her responsibilities include underwriting, marketing, customer support, managing client relationships, and seeking new business opportunities for accounts in her territory. Patrice is a licensed insurance broker in the state of California and is an active participant in numerous California trade associations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Cameron.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. Hopefully, this will give you a good overview of all the current goings-on with the U.S. Tariffs that are being implemented, the Chinese trade tariffs that are being implemented in retaliation or in response to the U.S., as well as other tariffs that have been implemented and the various tools that the executive is using at this time to influence trade, and ultimately, to focus in on our subject today, its effect on the bond. Every importer obviously has to have a customs bond, and those customs bond and the amount of the bond will be impacted by the tariffs and the corresponding duty. So to give you some idea of what's going on, we thought it would be helpful proceed with an overview of the various tools available to the administration. And just as a baseline, obviously a tariff is a tax that's imposed by the government on imported goods and services. And it's an ad valorem tax based on the price paid or payable. This is usually the common transaction valuation. Obviously, many of you are custom brokers on the line, so you're very familiar with this, as well as importers, because ultimately this is the amounts paid in your 7501. A quota. Now there are quotas as to the amounts of goods that can be brought in at a preferential duty rate. Common example of this is butter, and many people put their butter into a warehouse and then will import it on the quota date to get a pro rata share. And thereafter will pay a higher duty rate if they don't qualify for that day's quota. An absolute quota strictly limits the aggregate quantity of goods that may be brought into the United States. So there should be an absolute maximum number, and therefore there's no ability to import beyond the quota amount, even if you pay a correspondingly higher duty rate. So these are some of the tools that have been implemented, and to be specific, for example, certain countries have sought to address quota rather than increased tariff amounts to avoid the higher, more punitive tariffs. Anti-dumping, there's a common question: what's the difference between anti-dumping and countervailing? Anti-dumping occurs when the foreign manufacturer sells at less than fair value, causing injury to the United States industry. These are often very protracted and ongoing investigations. The cases can be held open for years and can have an impact on the ability of the traders to do business in a predictable manner when the investigations are ongoing at the front end. And of course, when they close out, anyone knows. I want to point out to you as well that we've tried to give you resource links to drill down into any of the subject matter that you discussed today. And so there should be a hyperlink on most of the pages that you'll be seeing that can help you understand where we got the information from and how to do additional research. Countervailing is basically establishes when a government provides assistance and subsidies, such as tax breaks. One could argue that yesterday the United States announced through the Department of Agriculture essentially a food aid, going back to the Depression era rules in which it arises, to either give monies or subsidies to farmers in order to help them with their the increased tariffs that they're being subjected to in China, or in some cases purchasing of goods where the farmer can evidence that there has been a failure of market. They can't sell the goods, that they've suffered damage, and that they have inventories on hand. In those cases, the government may come in and purchase that excess supply. Of course, the devil's in the details: how much they'll pay, how long it'll take, and the impact on the relationships that have been built by U.S. exporters overseas, and the long-term effect on the business remains to be seen. So in some cases, while certainly farmers appreciate having some subsidy or some benefit from the government, there is a question as to whether or not, at what cost, and wouldn't they rather have the relationship in the foreign marketplace. First, we want to talk about Section 232. Now, Section 232 focuses on the executive branch's ability to address tariffs because of a national security issue. And what you'll see this is being focused on the steel industry. So this is really where the administration first launched the tariffs, and it was focused on this because this is clearly within the purview of the president and the executive to impose these because of national security issues. And it would be hard or very difficult to argue that tariffs or absolute quotas on steel and aluminum aren't within the purview of the executive under Section 232. I would also mention that just a couple of days ago, the United States opened remarks on Section 232 hearings with respect to the automobile and automotive parts imports. And we had some remarks that were commented by Wilbur Ross. These are available through the USTR website and speak to the beginning of this investigation, which started, I believe, on July 19th. So we have ongoing broadening, if you will, of these types of tools beyond the current steel and aluminum. And as this slide talks about, it's basically finding an unfair trade practice. Does not require finding of an unfair trade practice like anti-dumping or countervailing. And it proceeds that basically there's a substantial cause or a serious injury or a threat to domestic, not so much domestic industry, but the security of the United States. And so now I have another slide here just kind of illustrating, these are a series of cartoons and slides that have been out in the news and kind of give you a visual image of how people are reacting to these tariffs. The 301, as amended, really do focus more on the harm to industry and the ability of U.S. industry to be competitive. And these are, in this case, self-initiated from the United States Trade Representative as a result of petitions filed by industry. And then there's been multiple listing of products in the last 60 days that will be subject to tariffs on goods made in China specifically. And there's been both a list of the items that are believed that will have the tariffs assessed, and there are ones that are being contemplated. The combined lists are over 1,000 tariff lines, and each one of these can be found at various websites, particularly here. There's a list provided to you, list 1, and this is starting July 1st with an impact estimated at $34 billion. And then list 2 is another $16 billion, where this is subject to ongoing public notice and comment, and I'll give you the timetable for that. I believe the 301 hearings started yesterday and are ongoing today, and there's a series of parties that are testifying to that, and in fact, there's a list of the STR available. And today's comments, yes, are ongoing, and right now, those have just adjourned as of 12:01 p.m. Eastern, with commentary from various parties, including Purolite, American Chemical, Reynolds Consumer Products, and others, as well as Schneider National Transportation and a variety of other entities discussing with the USTR the impact of these tariffs. So this is an ongoing process. And if you're interested, there's a 200-page report where the USTR found that China has been engaged in industrial policy to transfer technology, the theft of intellectual property and technology to the detriment of the United States. And as you might expect, these have, of course, been challenged in some places as to their validity. I believe the United States has filed, somewhat ironically, multiple WTO actions with respect to Chinese retaliation to these findings. Articles of interest, just because of in the interest of time, we're trying to make sure that we don't overlap too much here. There's some interesting articles that have been published by various, the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and various others. This gives you an overview of the 301 investigations, the approval of the tariffs, the reaction by Chinese to them, and the like. And so these articles might be helpful and were resources for the production of this presentation. So, as any good trade war, you need to have two sides. And one of the issues that we can expect is some form of retaliation. While there have been retaliation by Europeans and by other trading partners, we decided to focus on the Chinese retaliation to the 301 investigation. The U.S. first imposed its duty. China fired back, accusing the United States and WTO of setting up the largest trade war in history. They have promised to impose and have imposed tariffs that would compel the United States to pay approximately $1 for dollar impact on products. And the summary of this, because this is all still very much in flux and coming out, is a series of articles here that you can refer to in more detail about what the Chinese are doing in the retaliation, how it's going to take form, and what is going to happen. And so these are kind of a broad stroke approach to how the Chinese retaliation is taking shape, and Certainly, it's going to have an impact on U.S. manufacturing, and we expect that to have, of course, an impact on the bond. So this is kind of a lesson here briefly. One of the things that we can look to is, what does history teach us? Historically, higher tariffs have led to economic slowdown. And when George Bush implemented steel tariffs in 2002, we had a decrease in GDP of $30.4 million. So if history teaches us anything, we can presume that this type of percentage GDP, which, in relationship to the total industry is rather small, but nonetheless, it's telling as to what we can expect if this were to occur. Also, trade wars will, of course, affect central bank policy, result in interest rate changes and inflation. And earlier this week, Trump was tweeting, I believe, on Monday, and it's hard to keep track about how this is moving, but there were questions about whether or not the Fed should raise interest rates, its impact on the recovery, its impact on the stock market, and whether or not the Fed's policy was properly aligned with the administration's policy with respect to trade. There were also allegations of currency manipulation against the Chinese and other parties as to whether they're artificially manipulating in their currency so that their currency becomes cheaper relative to the US dollar, which has been strengthening over the last couple of weeks. So it's this type of disruption in monetary policy that can cause additional disruption within the supply chain. And what we've seen also is a slowdown in economic growth, and it will likely lead to lower banking revenues and lower finance revenues. And that's a good bellwether of the industry to understand how will this impact us on the larger macro level. And we'll dig into some of the micro as we go on through the slide presentations, but it's important to see that you have basically multiple tools, whether you're talking about tariffs, you're talking about quotas under 232 or under 301, which are forming a situation where GDP is expected to decrease. This is a great slide, I think, provided to us by Bloomberg. If you look at world GDP projected by tariff rate, so if you have an increased tariff, you see a decrease in GDP. That's the white line. As you go and increase the number of tariff rates from blue to red to purple, which is lower than the current contemplated rates of many of the Trump administration's tariff proposals at 25%, you see a dramatic decrease of $470 billion in GDP globally. Now, this is going to be prospectively very bad news for the US economy, but there are arguments on both sides of the table. Certainly, there are particular industries that may be targeted. At the moment, this slide illustrates what the trade war tariffs enacted and threatened are, and it's provided by Business Insider approximately 2 days ago. So we have 25% on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, 20% on washing machines, 30% on solar energy modules, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. And now we have another $16 billion worth of trade at the 25% rate, another 10% on other Chinese goods, and 20% on cars and car parts. Obviously, the car part market is one of the largest issues, especially in the Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, because I believe both on imports and on exports, the largest finished good brought in and out of this port is autos. If it's not autos, it's wearing apparel, which would be running a close second, although wearing apparel might escape some of this because apparel is the shift of apparel manufacturing to countries like Bangladesh, which one could argue, and speaking to some of the my clients that work with the Indian market, they believe, for example, that the Indian marketplace will benefit from the current trade wars because of, and you may notice this, that there's a lot of talk about Europe, there's a lot of talk about Asia, specifically China and some of the targeted places there, but almost no conversation about the Indian marketplace. And if anyone may be a winner in all of this, one could argue that the Indian economy may be the largest beneficiary. And there's some support for that. And let me go down to this slide and get ahead of myself, actually. So we have these two here that are going to be clearly be looking at an industry by industry analysis. Also, when you have this, you have a change in supply chain. Recently, there was Foxconn moved to Minnesota. There's quite a bit of splash about that about 2 weeks ago, right in line with the Harley-Davidson discussions. And what we see is that manufacturers, in reaction to changes in tariffs and duty rates, and also domestic consumption, will move their manufacturing to that place of consumption to avoid importation issues and instability in the supply chain. So one example would be the Foxconn facility being built in Minneapolis. Obviously, the onshoring of that product, although one would question how much of their supply chain needs still come from China and what percentage of the manufacturing is being done here. That is certainly the case with BMW and American Honda Motor Company and other Japanese manufacturers that manufacture either in Kentucky, Alabama, or in Ohio, where a large percentage of the parts that are assembled into those vehicles are imported from foreign sources. But in reaction to this, you also see Tesla. Tesla is now going to be opening up a facility in China to be manufacturing in China instead of in California in an effort to increase their market there and obviously to avoid the implication of certain tariffs that may be forthcoming if the 232 actions with respect to the automobile and automotive parts industries continues to move down the track and goes the way of steel and aluminum. And it becomes a question as to who will be the winner when it comes to that. Here are some of the clear losers in all of this, at least in the short term. And this is one of these industries, if you're currently either exporting or importing on behalf of these industries, you should be taking special note. So getting from the macro down into the micro, we have approximately $2.5 billion of meat. That's according to the Wall Street Journal that came out 2 days ago with respect to stockpiles that are being increased. And we have stockpiling going on both sides. We have really high volumes here in the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach. I travel through the port every day on my way home and my way to the office, and the truck traffic and the strain on the highway to and from the port is tremendous right now. In fact, there is a chassis shortage in the harbor right now that is contributing to congestion because so many importers are attempting to import their fall inventories today because they're trying to get ahead of the tariffs and they want to make sure that they have adequate inventory for the fourth quarter, but not have that fourth quarter be subject to the increased tariffs that are under contemplation by the Trump administration. So in anticipation that the tariffs will be going, prudent importers are pushing more through their supply chain. At the same time, parties that already have experienced large tariff increases are stockpiling in the domestic marketplace. If you'll notice, you can go right now to the U.S. supermarket and for like 99 cents a pound, purchase sweet cherries. because sweet cherries that were previously being exported from Washington to China, which is their largest export market for cherries, has basically ceased. You have a dramatic decrease in the amount of cherries being shipped from the United States to China. And what you do see is an increase in the amount of Turkish cherries. So Turkey, earlier this spring, set up and anticipated this demand. It has increased the supply of cherries to China dramatically by tenfold. And also you see increases in U.S. soybean deals being canceled, and the implications of that for many of our agricultural producers. One of the counter arguments, by the way, to winners and losers is the impact of Vietnamese, what is the countervailing or anti-dumping duties that were assessed against Chinese manufacturers. One statistic I saw was a decrease by $100 million in the Chinese, $100 million in the Chinese exports of wooden furniture to the United States following the assessment of anti-dumping duties in 2005. What you also saw was a corresponding increase in Vietnamese imports of the same product. So the place of production changed from China to Vietnam. And since opening Vietnam, we've basically seen a 400+% increase in the amount of trade between the United States and Vietnam in a very short period of time. I believe the statistics are good through 2016, but Vietnam could arguably be seen as a winner in what is arguably been an ongoing cold trade war. So really the bottom line is scope. How many products are going to be affected, and how do you know what your products are going to be affected? And I encourage everybody to look to the Federal Registry notices specifically that identify the HTS codes and what HTS codes may be affected by your importers. Look at the duration. How long are these expected to last? Trump's remarks to the Veterans of Foreign War yesterday stated to just be, quote unquote, a little patient. So all of this arguably could end quite quickly. But as Patrice is going to explain, there will be longer term implications for the bond. Obviously, there's going to be a disruption in the trust relationships between buyers and sellers, and potential insolvency for large percentages of the market who are unable to weather the storm. I will say to you that this again refers to the ongoing public hearings that just concluded over the additional 301 tariffs, and there's a link to the public hearings that were ongoing today. This is an interesting slide, I think, here. It shows a timeline and kind of the aggregate implications of the tariffs. And the larger the bubbles, the greater the effect. So what we see here is certain industry segments being more affected than others. I encourage you to look at the New York Times interactive article and the trade war article concerning Michigan that highlight how these tariffs impact specific industries on a dollar-for-dollar basis. So what's next? What can you do as you sit here? If you're looking for information to advise your clients, to advise your importers, to prepare your own supply chain, well, know that the 301 hearings on Chinese modifications will be the next hearings that will be forthcoming. At the end of the week here, we have requests for filing, to appear at the testimony and give some form of testimony. Submission of written comments will be on the 17th. August 20th will be the Section 301 for the actual hearings, and then post-hearing rebuttal comments will be due by the 30th. So what does that mean for you? That means that you can expect to have additional rounds of tariff and responses to tariff retaliation by the Chinese within the next 30 to 60 days. So certainly within the fourth quarter, I think we can expect that. In addition, I want to point out that undoubtedly some of you will ask about whether or not there are going to be an exclusion process for 301 hearings. And I do want to mention USTR has published a methodology to get out of the 301s. If you want to file a request for product exclusion, the period ends, and you might note this, on October 9th, 2018. There'll be a public hearing process, and exclusions will be effective from 1 year of the date of publication in the Federal Register, and will apply retroactively to July 6th, 2001. Another comment I want to make is that about a week and a half ago, we learned that 301 tariff duty rates are something that you can claim duty drawback on. This is not a drawback seminar, so I will leave that to people who can do that and spend a whole hour on that subject matter. But I do note that there is duty drawback available if you're part of a global supply chain where you'll be importing these goods and subsequently exporting them perhaps to a South American subsidiary or customers outside of the United States where you can apply for duty drawback. So with that, I'll give it over to Patrice to talk about how does everything I just spent the last half an hour discussing affect your bond?
Good morning, everybody. So we're just going to go over some bond insufficiency questions and some tricks and tools where Roanoke might be able to help you or your customer. First off, I just wanted to talk about the continuous bond and how it's calculated. Since e-bonds, we've seen a huge decrease in the issuance of single transaction bonds because you can get a bond on file so quickly. And so we're just really going to focus this presentation on the sufficiency of continuous bonds and how the tariffs are affecting that. The continuous bond is generally calculated at 10% of the total duties, taxes, and fees paid or payable in the last 12 months. This also includes anti-dumping and countervailing duties, as well as the new tariffs. Something to really keep in mind, though, that it is a rolling 12-month period that Customs uses to calculate. It's not done by renewal or effective date of the bond. So, for example, if CBP were calculating bond sufficiencies for this month of July, the duty would actually be calculated from July 2017 through June of 2018. So who monitors bond sufficiency? Yes, go ahead.
Patrice, I'm sorry, it's Jennifer. I just wanted to interrupt real quick, and you may have mentioned it, but you do have on the go-to webinar pane a bunch of attachments or handouts that include the bond sufficiency calculation. There's 3 different files that everyone can grab right from their own go-to webinar handouts pane.
Thank you, Jennifer. And also the Federal Register notice that Cameron mentioned is also in that pane. So going on to the bond sufficiency, as many of you know, the Revenue Division, Office of Finance, is the one responsible for ensuring that all continuous bonds are sufficient, and it's really just to protect the revenue of the United States. On average, we normally see anywhere from 30 to 60 mandated increases issued on a monthly basis, but I can tell you that since the new tariffs have come out, this number practically tripled last month in June. This is still not really a large percentage of the overall bonds on file with CBP, but if you as the importer or one of your clients are issued a notice, it can certainly be a major headache. In 2015, Customs had changed the time frame to respond to an insufficiency notice from 30 days to 15 days, which gives you now even less time to comply. From our perspective as the surety company, the larger the bond, the type of commodity, the aggregate liability, as well as the importer's history with us, can potentially cause underwriting concerns. And as our concerns grow, we may require the review of financial statements, general indemnity agreements, or even collateral in the form of a letter of credit. A bond that's rendered insufficient because you didn't timely replace it with a bond in the proper amount required by Customs can also cause importers to incur unnecessary expenses and delays, such as possibly having to issue single transaction bonds or demurrage, or even the risk of cargo going into general order. I can also tell you that recently we have seen customs render bonds insufficient without any notice, without a mandated increase letter, stating that they're grossly insufficient. So basically that just means that your bond is turned off right away. The bond is fully saturated, and customs doesn't want to have any more entries done against that bond because they don't feel like the revenue is protected. An example of this recently for us was we had a customer who was importing steel, and they had a $400,000 bond on file. We received a notice demanding a $1.1 million replacement bond, and the current bond was rendered immediately insufficient by customs. The notice was received right after renewal date of the bond, and this caused an aggregate concern for the surety on top of just having the steel be a part of the commodity and the new tariffs. And aggregate concerns are important to the surety company because as the exposure of, we have the exposure of paying customs up to the full bond amount for each bond term, that there are remaining unliquidated entries or open claims. So in this case, we weren't just looking at a $1.1 million bond, we were really looking at an aggregate of 2 terms of $400,000 plus the $1.1 million, totaling a $1.9 million of exposure to us. Customs allowed for a fast termination, which I'll explain in my next slide what that is, but the underwriting still needed to occur because of the large amount of aggregate that we had. We were able to get the underwriting done fast and approve the rewrite in time for the importer to not incur any unnecessary costs, but I can tell you that's not always the case. It really depends on how quickly we're able to obtain underwriting information or requirements from the importer, the bank, or you as the customs broker. And I think Cameron pointed this out earlier as well, but I just want to really make a point to say that it's really not just the surety company that has financial concerns or risk concerns with all of these tariffs. I believe that it really is part of the trade process, and anyone part of that process that might have credit terms with parties involved. It could be the importers, even the banks, customs brokers, freight forwarders, really anyone that's involved with the transportation. So there is a new term technically with customs that's come up recently, and it's called a fast termination. When your bond is rendered insufficient and you're not able to replace it with the required amount in time, we have seen the use of fast terminations as a solution. A fast termination is allowed with the termination date effective immediately, giving you the ability to file a new bond effective the next day to avoid a longer delay of not being able to import. You would need to write a letter to the Revenue Division with good reasoning for making this request, and it is subject to their approval. I really wouldn't use this as a risk management tool per se, but more as a last resort if you get stuck in this type of a situation. In some cases recently, we have seen this stated specifically on the mandated increase letter received from customs without even asking permission to do so. So I would encourage you to make sure that you read those letters closely, not only for the possibility of having a fast termination approval, but also in case it is rendered insufficient immediately. So how can we help? Well, we have 3 ways to assist you before you actually receive a mandated increase. We have automation with our weekly bond sufficiency reviews, nationwide help with our service teams, and our management report usage in FastBond, which is our online bond system that many of you are probably using or aware of. So let's start with automation. This here on the screen is a copy of our import bond sufficiency summary report. We conduct a weekly sufficiency check on all of our active import bonds. A notice is triggered to our customers at 90% saturation of the bond, and then again at 100% saturation. And I would tell you that almost always we see a mandated increase letter issued the month after the 100% saturation letter is sent out. If we see that anti-dumping or countervailing duties are applicable, we do trigger our first notice at 80% saturation, as many times these do require heavier underwriting requirements, as I'm sure you guys are aware of. If you're interested in receiving these notices, just contact your local Roanoke representative and they can have you set up to receive by email when they are issued. We also send this notice at renewal to help you analyze from past imports if your customer would like to increase their bond upon renewal, avoiding the possibility of further aggregate concerns by the surety. The list that's here on the screen is the basic information that we provide you, and we do encourage you to use this as a sales tool when talking to your customers. Because this letter is really given in a generic format, you can give it directly to them and talk to them about their activity. And I would just also like to remind you that if the entry count is 0 on this report, then it really means the bond hasn't been used in the last 12 months, and perhaps the importer may not even need it anymore.
Hi, Patrice, it's Jennifer again. Do you mind going back 1 second? I just wanted to show everybody that letter one more time, because we do get questions a lot when we send this notice at renewal. With the import bond invoice, we get asked every month by different customers, what is this? And so I just wanted to reemphasize to everyone, this is a great sales tool for you to use to send to your customer. We do not put Roanoke's name on it so that our customs brokers can take it. They can even print it on their own corporate letterhead and give it to their import customer as a value-added service to them to say, hey, here's a summary of your imports over the last 12 months. It's certainly an option that's available. The other thing is that if we have a customs broker that is interested in getting this, just the data and not this letter itself, we can do that at renewal, I should say. At renewal, we can send those in a spreadsheet format so that you can use the data as you know, however you want to on your end to notify your customers. It's a great sales tool.
Yes, so the next way that we can help, of course, is with our knowledge and our customer service teams. The photos you see here on the screen are of all of our bond managers across the country, as well as some of our senior bond customer service personnel. We pride ourselves in being located throughout the U.S., strategically stationed near the largest ports in Miami, Charleston, New York, Chicago, Houston, and Long Beach, enabling us to better service you wherever you're at. Every person on the screen has been with the company in the bond product specifically for more than 10 years, and many of you have probably heard from them or even had the pleasure of meeting anybody. With this many years of knowledge and experience between us, we are sure to be able to assist you with any situation and really encourage you to utilize us. Our motto is to make the complicated uncomplicated. All of our offices also have customer service representatives with many years of experience and high levels of underwriting authority to be able to assist you in your local time zone. If you should have an urgent situation outside of your assigned Roanoke service team, you can contact any one of our offices across the country for assistance. We also have Colleen Clark, who is our Vice President of Surety Trade Relations, and she's currently serving as the President of the International Trade Surety Association, and she's also served 2 terms on COAC. And we have several other employees who have served on or are currently serving on both TSN committees and COAC working groups. We do our very best to make sure we are involved with customs on both a national level and local levels, just to stay on top of current issues that you may be involved in. So please contact us anytime to utilize our resources whenever you can. Our third way of helping you manage sufficiency is through our bond management reports and fast bonds. Some of you may already be signed up for this or are aware of them, but I just wanted to go over them a little bit with you. We receive a lot of data from customs on our surety download, and we've compiled this information into some canned reports to better assist you. We can provide you really with anything, as Jennifer stated before, but this is something that's at your access without having to contact us. There are reports generated on your filer code overall, which can include open FP&F claims, ID bills, and such, as well as reports specific to a bond number. These reports require special access, as we didn't want to give pertinent information to every user. So if you have been given access, you'll notice a management tab when you log into FastBond. That's what's shown on the screen, and then when you actually hit report, you can see all of the reports in there. There is a user guide as well that describes every report that's available to you if you want to see what the information specifically is that you're looking at. If you don't see the tab and would like further information, then you can contact one of our staff and we can certainly help you out. This is really the next screen after you are looking at the reports. These reports have multiple uses, but the one that I think would best assist you with bond sufficiency is going to be the entry detail under principal reports. And this report will show you the entries for the last 12 months by principal and by CBP bond number. You will only have access to view these reports if you are the current broker of record on the specific bond you're trying to get the information from. Also, to protect the importer and information from customs, the system does ask you to acknowledge that you have the principal's authorization to receive this information. However, that can be an email, a letter from the importer, or simply a current customs power of attorney. And we're not looking to collect that information necessarily. It just asks that you have it on file for our records. So remember, we are here to help you in any way we can. Take advantage and utilize our automation tools, our knowledgeable staff, and our fast bond management reports. I would encourage you to be proactive. Put together a list of your import clients who you know are importing commodities subject to these new tariffs or could potentially be one of the new tariffs. Go over and determine a proper bond amount and how you will handle the increased amount of cash transactions with your customers. Not just the importer having to have more cash available to pay the duty, but we also know that customs brokers do front duties to customs on behalf. So, make sure that that is all available. Once you have determined a plan, I would say talk to your Roanoke representative to start the underwriting process before the insufficiency occurs. We don't just have a time frame of underwriting, but if a letter of credit is involved, the bankers certainly are going to need some time to underwrite the importer requiring the letter of credit. We know a lot of times the banks require a cash deposit to have the letter of credit. It really depends on the bank and depends on your relationship with your bank. And of course, I would say sign up for our fast bond management reports as well as our sufficiency notices, as this can really help you get ahead of the game. Do you want to add anything to that?
Jennifer again. I just wanted to chime back in on our potential insufficiency notices. So the thing with that is we will generate the notice whether you're signed up to get them automatically or not. And so by signing up, we'll automatically send the notice to your email address when we trigger a bond at 90% saturation. If you're not signed up, we send the email to your Roanoke Bond Service team, and they'll get it out to you. So the only thing is that there could be a little bit of a delay as they go through and check all their emails to send it out. So you'll get it eventually. If you don't sign up, you'll get it quicker if you do.
Patrice, I think one of the things that will be helpful for our audience is to really do take a proactive approach to this, because as we discussed yesterday, the vast majority of importers have a very small bond in place, only $50,000. And with this increase in consumption, stockpiling of inventory in the near term, in this current quarter, you're going to see a tremendous spike in duty, basically, spend, which will then, if they're subject to the review during this quarter, will result in a dramatic increase in the bond amount. This is basically going to have a snowball effect. And if these importers do not have a pre-existing relationship with a bank for a letter of credit because they never had to have a letter of credit before, basically what we're talking about is a change for the average importer who frankly never had to have any form of collateral in place because the bond was so low. Is that pretty consistent with what you're expecting?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And the mandated increases that we've seen have been over $1 million. And, we've been writing bonds for a very long time, and a $50,000 bond is not as big of a concern to us as something that's $2, $5, $10 million. Keeping in mind that it really is, it's a big change, and it's not just the cash you're doing on the tariffs, it's going to be actually covering the bond. I'm not saying that every bond is going to require letters of credit, but I think it's something that you should certainly be prepared for as the concerns change and with the higher tariff rates.
And I'll tell you that I did a presentation last week before BAFT. It's a group of bankers. Specifically, the amount of people in the banking industry that are involved in the letter of credit issuance is relatively small. And they're isolated in some ways, so they don't have a lot of resources. And I don't think the banking industry is fully prepared today to write, you know, a 25% to a 75% increase in letters of credit overnight, simply because of the staffing. So I think that it's prudent for our custom brokers on the line here and our importers who don't have banking relationships to make sure that the importers who are at higher than expected saturation points to reach out and find those banking relationships, look to the people who write letters of credit, because that process could be time consuming. And if you only have the 15 days, that's not going to work out very well.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you have 15 days to comply to the letter and then 15 days to actually process the termination. So there's 30 days if it's a standard mandated increase, but still 30 days is not a lot of time when you're talking about that.
Not when you consider we only have how many working days in a month, people go on vacation, especially this time of year. August is tough to get a hold of people and get things done.
Yeah.
So that's all to be considered. Also, I wanted to throw out there that there's been some recent case law discussing the issue of bond sufficiency and the uses of bonds. One of the things that everybody who is a custom broker should be looking at and be knowledgeable of is the guidance provided in Customs Directive 3510.04 or 3510.04. That's part of your handouts as well. And that really does help summarize what people need to know in addressing this, because I can just hear the importer saying, well, this is arbitrary, this is capricious, how can we do this, and what will be impacted? And then certainly having knowledge of that particular directive will be useful in explaining it.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add in terms of the mandated increase letter. I mean, those they don't get sent to the customs broker. Customs doesn't know you're technically working with them or the broker of record in terms of what that means to us. So the letter only gets sent to the importer via regular mail, and then it gets sent to the surety company by a download. So we do receive them pretty quickly by email. And we immediately, once it's issued. So you're going to probably, as a customs broker, hear from us before your importer may have even received the letter. So I also think that's why some of our insufficiency notices ahead of time will be helpful for you to be able to start to work on that, because it gives you a month or maybe 2 months leeway before that letter is actually issued.
And I do also want to mention that a lot of these bonds are subject to review by the port director, and the port directors typically have a lot of latitude about what they can assess if there's quote unquote great risk to the government involved.
Right.
And there hasn't been a lot of case law on what is or isn't within the purview of the port director to review, and what are going to be the implications. I can point to a recent case before the CIT where an automotive importer was subjected to a triple the entered value bond. And in order to get a temporary restraining order held against customs, the court required the importer to prove that this would cause an irreparable harm to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that people can always use this avenue or it is appropriate in every situation, but know that if you wanted to challenge customs and you could not get administrative relief, the Court of International Trade will put a very high burden on the company to challenge the actions and the discretion of customs. So this irreparable harm standard, in other words, are you going to be put out of business? Do you put customs on notice of this? How do you approach customs? And one of the things that importers are advised to do through their broker and through counsel is you really want to develop that relationship with the local port. Talking to headquarters or talking to the Cs is helpful, but ultimately the right hand may not be talking to the left hand. And we all have to recognize that government works at the pace of government. And with the strains and demands on customs manpower, it's really a challenge, I think, for the average field office to manage their resources and direct this to an area where, frankly, they haven't had to deploy a lot of resources. If you talk to the field office here in California, they're going to, especially Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, the immigration issues for people entering into the United States up at LAX takes a tremendous amount of manpower to work with those individuals. And as a consequence, the trade often gets short shrift. So don't count on customs to be particularly responsive to the economic impact on your business of a particular change in bond sufficiency. I think you have to be very proactive and know that government officials are going to continue to take their vacations. The staffing is not looking to be changing too dramatically anytime soon. And, while Commissioner McAleenan is doing everything he can, I think, to enforce trade regulation, I think their target is going to be more about enforcement and less than reviewing bond sufficiency issues for individual importers on a particular day.
Yeah, I mean, the local port on the bond sufficiency does that more on single transaction bonds. The revenue division in Indianapolis really does the continuous bonds. But I do know what you're saying, because we have also seen an increase of mandated increases, if you will, on single transaction bonds that aren't, fitting within what Customs is looking for.
Good point. That was a single transaction scenario for the automotive importer, and had to do with some intellectual property issues. But I think that what you're going to see is a crossfire increase in tariff, but also increased scrutiny to intellectual property issues. So if you have importers that have prospective intellectual property issues importing from China and are subject to these increases in duties, it's almost a triple threat that's going to result in a much higher level of scrutiny to them, and therefore a greater risk. And so those parties, if you can start looking at into these reports that you're offering, it really is a benefit.
Yeah. Okay, it's Jennifer. I just wanted to interrupt for a second to give everybody an opportunity to submit some questions here. Thanks everyone for joining and taking the time to view the presentation. Now is a good time to enter your questions using the questions pane on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar viewer control panel. And while you're submitting that, I'd just like to take the opportunity to let you know that you will get a short survey that will launch at the conclusion of the webinar. We really appreciate your feedback, as your answers help us continually improve our content. Cameron and Patrice, we do have some questions here that I'd like to start with right away. The first one here is, Patrice, do you expect underwriting delays due to increases in requests?
No, I don't. We have full staff in all of our offices, as well as a surety division in our corporate office with plenty of underwriters. So no, I don't. I think that we are fully staffed and ready to take on any new bonds that we need to. And like I said, it's still a small number of what we're looking at. So even if we're receiving 120 mandated increases in a month, not all of them are because of the tariffs. They can just be standard increases. And I would say it's still not a big portion of all the bonds that we write with Customs.
Yeah, I do have some statistics here from Customs. The revenue division is who issues the demand for the increased bond amount, and they provide statistics every once in a while. And like you mentioned earlier, Patrice, we see about 30 to 60 for Roanoke customers bonds a month. And in June, Customs issued nationwide 525 demands for larger bonds. And then in July, they've issued 183. And Patrice, wouldn't you agree? I mean, we got all the underwriting sorted out awfully quick for any that even needed underwriting review.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that from my experience and from what I've seen across the country, we really haven't had any issues where there wasn't where we weren't able to get a bond on file and to assist the importer and not have a delay in terms of that. We are flexible. I will tell you guys that. You know, if we know that they're working with the bank and there's some delays, we have been okay with accepting before the letter of credit is finally issued, you know, just that there's some sort of draft in place. So I would definitely encourage you to talk to your local offices and your representatives, and we're definitely there to assist you and try to help. We don't want to see an importer not be able to import, and we certainly don't want to see single transaction bonds. As I mentioned in the slides, you know, we have aggregate issues, and with all of this and some things that are subject to PGAs, you're looking at 3 times the value, which just increases that a lot more. So we're definitely not trying to withhold anything and trying to stop an importer from importing.
Do you foresee situations where you terminate bonds due to the excess liabilities, such as sometimes happens when there's dumping or countervailing duties involved?
Like midterm, are we talking? I guess I would say that, you know, if we see, so we're looking at all the bonds that we write on a weekly basis. If we see when it comes to anti-dumping, if we see entries that are type 3 entries, we're going to reach out to the customs broker and get some more information and underwrite it. If there is a requirement, let's just say for financials or a letter of credit or something along those lines, and it isn't complied to, yeah, we will terminate the bond. But as long as you're working with somebody and you're showing a due diligence to do so, I mean, we're not going to just terminate the bond just because we see an anti-dumping entry. I think that the harder part with the tariffs is, you know, we don't get necessarily the HTS codes on the downloads on continuous bonds, so we don't necessarily know what everything is subject to. We can see the increase in the amount of duty being paid, but that would be something that you could talk to us about as well.
Cameron, I've got a question for you. So if an import is subject to dumping, does the dumping duty still apply on imports subject to Section 232 and 301?
On top of it, yeah.
Yep.
There's been no change in the fact you have the additional duties that would be due, and you would have anti-dumping duties that are due.
Okay, and Patrice, I did get a clarification on the other question there. If an example, you know, if an importer of steel who's going to see a 25% increase on everything they import, would you terminate that due to the excess liability?
No, I mean, we're not going to just terminate a bond right away. If you contact us and you let us know that, again, that the importer would like to increase their bond, we can terminate it and replace it with underwriting if it's large enough where we feel like underwriting is needed. But no, we're not going to just terminate a bond. We really can't do that just because we see that they're going to have some increased liability with the new tariffs.
Okay. Let's see. I do have one last question here. Will we be giving a handout on the fast termination?
Yeah, we can. If you guys would like that,
probably yeah, we can do that. We can make sure that we send out the info. We have seen it actually listed on the demand for, you know, when customs will send an insufficiency letter. In some cases, they will actually attach a letter with the instructions. So it's a 2-page notice saying, here's the insufficiency letter, and we'll accept a fast termination, and here's how to do it. So we can certainly include that.
Yeah, and we can include also, you know, just how to sign up for our management reports and a little bit more on the sufficiency notices. The only other thing I kind of wanted to add, since I see that there's some questions on anti-dumping and the tariffs, and obviously these are different, I do want to mention that from our perspective, anti-dumping is still a lot larger of a concern, and that's just because the retrospective act of how the entries are handled, and that they can remain unliquidated for, you know, many times 5, 10, 15 years. So our aggregate and our liability on those bonds lasts a lot longer. As of right now, we haven't seen that with the tariffs. So, I mean, it's all very new, and that's not part of the plan. But because the duties are paid up front, and the entry should liquidate in the regular process, it really is just a matter of the bonds being larger, and just the solvency of the importer being able to actually pay the duty to customs. So I'm sure you all know this, because I think we've said it a million times, but anti-dumping has and still continues to be our largest claim year after year on all of our bonds.
Would Roanoke require collateral just because the goods are subject to Section 301 tariff?
No, not necessarily. That's not the only thing that we would be looking at. We're definitely looking at bond amount and the importer's history with us. If the importer has a history of open claims that they haven't resolved, or we've had to pay on their behalf, I mean, that's certainly going to be an issue. The start is really the bond amount. And if the bond amount is within a reason that we feel comfortable, then no. But as they get larger and larger, we will look at financial statements first to see the solvency of the importer again. And if we have some concerns with that, then we'll go from there.
Okay, I got one more question for Cameron. We have an importer who imports products that are normally dutiable at 3.5%. Some of these items are specifically for medical use and are therefore duty-free under 9817. Assume the 25% would apply even on the items that are for medical use?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, sure.
I got the 3% medical and assuming 25%. So
yeah, it says the question is assume that 25 would apply even on the items that are for medical use.
So what's the question?
Yeah.
Would they apply? Yeah, the answer is that the 25%, if it's specified in the 301 action that it's applicable to that HTF number, the answer is yes, the 25% would apply.
Okay. To the individual who submitted that, if we did not interpret your question correctly, just go ahead and type your question, your clarification in there. That is the last of the questions that we received. So I would like to wrap up and thank everyone for joining us today. We will leave this webinar open for about another 10 minutes, so you can submit any more questions that you may have, and we can reach out to you. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you, Patrice and Cameron.
Thank you.
Thank you.